Hey guys, the Network here. Hope you're doing well. So this video we will be covering Opnsense versus Pfsense. Now this is a bit of a weird video because I don't typically like to make versus videos because they tend to cause divides in communities and people tend to start lashing out at each other, and I don't want that. I want you guys to please keep things civil. I don't want you to say which firewall is the better one or which firewall you need to use. At the end of the day, use whatever you are comfortable with and what you are happy with. If you are using Pfsense and you're happy with it, continue using it. There's no reason for you not to use it. But I just want to bring up some of the points that I've discovered after researching both firewall vendors and both operating systems for a while. And I just like to post those findings here and see what you guys think about both of them. What do you think about Opnsense? What do you think about Pfsense? Let's have a fruitful discussion. So let's get into the video. So I think the first thing I want to talk about is the key differences between Pfsense and Opnsense in this long-standing battle between these two open source firewalls. Now, I want to make a point of that word open source because both of them in theory are open source firewalls. So Pfsense has the Pfsense Community Edition, and then Opnsense similarly has its Community Edition. Now these are open source, meaning if you took the source code and you copy that onto a box and you started changing it and updating it yourself, you can in essence create what we call a fork, and that could be your own firewall. Now, this is important to note because Pfsense is actually just a fork of something that was known as MonoWall. Now, MonoWall is just a precursor to Pfsense. It worked kind of the same. It did the same function. It was a firewall with a nice GUI, and you could change stuff and add firewall rules and do NAT. But it just wasn't the people that created it. Just I don't know why they couldn't maintain it anymore, but they quit the project. And then Pfsense decided, hey, we're going to continue this project, we're going to fork it. They created their own copy of it, and then they started maintaining it and updating it themselves, and from there Pfsense was born. Now again, this is important because Opnsense is born from Pfsense. It's actually just a fork of Pfsense. So the people that run Opnsense decided, hey, there's certain elements that we feel that we can do better. Maybe it's updates, maybe it's some security patches. We feel that it isn't consistently being done by Pfsense. We would like to take up that mantle ourselves. We're going to create our own fork copy, call it Opnsense, and that is how Opnsense was born. So they created a copy off of Pfsense, and Pfsense again was just a copy of MonoWall. So it's a bunch of copying, but in the development world, I think this actually happens quite a lot when it comes to open source. So it's nothing weird. But on the other side of the spectrum, you have what we call proprietary software. Now, what does that mean? Well, it means it's not open source. It means you can't just look at the source code and see what it's doing. It's basically encoded. We don't know what's in the source code. It's not freely available. And this is where stuff like Pfsense Plus comes into play, because with the Community Edition, you can change your firewall to a Pfsense Plus subscription, which enables additional features and functions on your firewall, but it also changes your firewall from open source to become proprietary. So you can't just see all of the source code anymore. That means it's no longer open source. Now, what is Pfsense Plus? Besides just adding the additional functions, it was actually created for businesses and enterprises to give them the type of service level agreements or SLAs that they might need. And it also just gives Pfsense a certain degree of control over the software, and just to make sure that things functions the way that they intended to function. Now, this is a double-edged sword almost, because a lot of the community members have seen that Pfsense will update stuff like their Pfsense Plus software, but they are not updating the Community Edition. So that has placed some doubt in a lot of people's mind, where they think, hey, Pfsense has dropped Community Edition. Now, I've spoken to some people at Netgate, and they've also assured me they haven't dropped Community Edition. They will bring out a new Community Edition, and even on the Pfsense website there is a roadmap for the new 2.7 Community Edition. So I'm pretty sure they will bring that out, but just something to take note of. Now, that doesn't mean Opnsense doesn't have a similar type of subscription model. They have what they call Opnsense for Business, and it does the same function. It's there for businesses and enterprises and gives you a certain level of support. But The difference with Opnsense is you can consistently still see that Opnsense updates their open source software or code. They just keep it updated. There's always changes or security patches or stuff that comes in. So this is why you'll see a lot of people mention that Opnsense is consistently also just updating their software, which is a pro as well. But we'll talk about that a little bit later in the video again. Now, here's also some more additional information. Both firewalls run off of FreeBSD. Now, FreeBSD is just an operating system. Think of this as Unix or Linux or Windows or something. It's just the back end where these firewalls run off of. But it's worth noting, and this is where I've watched the LTT video, where they wanted to upgrade their device or the network to a 25 gig infrastructure. However, their NIC on their server wasn't being picked up, and this was due to the version that Pfsense was natively running just didn't support that NIC's drivers. It wasn't loaded on FreeBSD at that point in time. Whereas Opnsense runs the latest version of FreeBSD, and those drivers were running off of that. So this is why LTT was able to then switch to Opnsense, and then that was able to pick up the NIC, and then they could use that 25 gig interface. Now, with this, it is important to note as well, Pfsense actually has another appliance or software called Tensor, which is supposed to serve that routing functionality. Now, this doesn't excuse them for running an older version of FreeBSD, but they definitely have something else for your routing or networking component. I also want to drill down on this a bit because I've seen other YouTubers also have issues with the FreeBSD drivers and where NICs aren't being picked up, or they might use something like a Realtek NIC and that just doesn't want to work at all. And a lot of the times the support that they receive or the feedback they receive from Netgate is, hey, it's not Intel, so we can't really support you, use something else, you know. And they say it's a FreeBSD limitation, it's not a Pfsense limitation, so they don't really take any accountability for that. And they should, because they are choosing to run this off of FreeBSD. So at least ensure that you are running the latest version of FreeBSD. And I'm pretty sure after the LTT video, they will start looking at upgrading the FreeBSD to 13.1 or something similar. I know there has been talk of them getting it to 13. I just haven't actually seen any implementation yet. Now, Opnsense features. Now, this slide is actually a little bit of a, I don't want to say a joke, because both firewalls pretty much do what the other firewall does. If I go to the next slide, where there's the Pfsense features, I basically copied and pasted this. Reason being, they are both supposed to be like next generation firewalls. They are supposed to be able to do stuff like IPv4 and IPv6. They're supposed to do stateful firewall or stateful packet inspection. It's supposed to be multi-WAN. It does VPN. It does high availability. There is SD-WAN in the form of zero tier with Opnsense or Tailscale with Pfsense. You're supposed to have IPS. It does NAT. It does VLANs. Like, the whole list is here for you to read through, but I have placed a link at the bottom of both of the slides where you can look at the feature sets for both firewalls. But in essence, they can both do what the other one does. So feature wise, you shouldn't have any issues. One big feature that I do think of now is VXLAN, actually, that Opnsense does, which the Pfsense does not do. But in that same breath, where I mentioned Pfsense has or Netgate does another appliance called Tensor. Tensor is supposed to do that role of VXLAN, so they're just kind of separating the network and firewalling components with different appliances. But this is the nice thing about the firewalls. If you really want, you can use either one if it's just for the features. But when it comes down to keeping stuff updated and modern and the latest builds and stuff, this is actually where Opnsense excels, because they always make sure that they have the latest current builds almost. All right, next slide is going to be a very difficult one, because this is going to be surrounding a bit of the controversies surrounding Pfsense. Now, I'm saying here, I'm addressing the elephant in the room, and we need to talk about this because a lot of the bigger YouTubers like Network Chuck, David Bomble, Tom Lawrence, they say how wonderful Pfsense is, and it is definitely a great firewall, but they don't mention any of the concerns that a lot of the people in the community can see. And the biggest concern that we've already brushed up on is the community concern regarding the community edition. Because if you look at stuff like the release schedule and patch notes, you don't really see anything happening with the community edition. It's been stagnating. It's just been sitting there the same way it's been sitting for the last, since release, I think. Whereas you can still see that Pfsense is consistently updating the Pfsense Plus stuff, the proprietary stuff. So it gives the appearance to the community and to me as a user that the community edition is on the back burner. It's not something that they really are actively looking at supporting. So if you really want that additional support or updates, then you typically need to switch to Pfsense Plus. But that also means that you're no longer using this as an open source firewall. You're now basically signing yourself to Pfsense and using their proprietary software, which you have no control over. You can't see anything. Next bit is, and this was super scary to me, and I'm wondering how I can go about describing this without making any scenes, because I don't want people to get upset or, you know, harass any company or anybody. But if you look at the Wikipedia page that I listed, which is Pfsense Wikipedia, this is how Wikipedia sees Pfsense. They were utilizing trademarks in bad faith. Now, what does that mean? Well, in essence, they had a domain registered which had the same naming convention as a competitor, and on this website there was a bunch of stuff that was disgusting. Actually, there was videos of things, there was descriptions of the firewall vendor, there were photos of the developers on the website, and you can use the Wayback Machine to go and look at the site and see what was done. But it was all about reputational damage, and to me it's absurd that you would go to that step or stage if you are also in essence, let's say, guilty of doing the same thing. You also just created a fork of another firewall, and now somebody forked your source code, and then you get upset at them and you do something as childish as that. That's not acceptable to me. It was on the level of bordering the early 2010s trolling. It's like the people from 4chan was trolling, and it's not nice. It's definitely not a good thing for a business to be doing, and I feel like that is something that a lot of people just throw on the wayside, and it shouldn't. It should not be forgotten that a competitor was treated like that, and I'm still disgusted. I don't know really how to talk about it differently. I know Pfsense has done a lot of steps in changing how they approach their competitors, and they've also basically, they had to give up the domain name that was associated with the competitor so that you know, there was no more trouble. But let's just face it, the damage was already done. If I was a new user and I was searching Opnsense and I got to that web page, you know, I would probably be scared off and I wouldn't use the software. So it's definitely one of the wildest things I've seen in recent memory when it comes to open source firewalls, and I hope I never see something like that again. And then the last big point of controversy is WireGuard. So in 2020, Netgate actually got somebody to develop WireGuard for Pfsense, and that is actually something to be commended for. That is a great initiative on their part. I actually think it is awesome that they tried to get WireGuard running. The only issue is when the dev that was working on the code basically submitted it to be implemented for FreeBSD and Pfsense, it got the go-ahead and it actually made it to Pfsense, but the people that actually run WireGuard, when they looked at the code, it scared them to their soul because it was full of bad code. There were vulnerabilities, there were code that didn't need to be there, there was a bunch of sleep states to fix things that shouldn't have been needing that to be fixed, and it just caused a huge mess for the open source community, up to a point where WireGuard had to be pulled off of Pfsense. They got rid of it, they killed it. They didn't want to use it anymore. And it only came back to Pfsense and FreeBSD like a year later. And I mean, that did a lot of reputational damage in my opinion, and it shouldn't have gotten to that point. I do think Netgate also learned the lesson from that, and they most likely, if they do endeavor to develop anything new like that, like a new package, then they will most likely speak to the people like WireGuard and ensure that everything is fine from the beginning so that they don't run into issues like that again. But it's still a big controversy and something that just won't fade away. It's going to be remembered. All right, so let's talk about some strong points. And I'm not going to bring up any bad points or weak points because I think both firewalls, like I said, does what the other one does. But here are some of the strong points of Opnsense that I can definitely pick up. And the first thing is the consistent updates. If you look at the Opnsense Twitter, it's almost weekly. You'll see they'll be talking about a patch day coming, and you know when the patch is going to be arriving so that you can update your Opnsense firewall for the latest security patches or additional features. And they even have a nice roadmap to show exactly what they're planning and what's going to be coming out. And it's really cool to see. So there's always consistent updates. It's almost bi-weekly or monthly. You will at least see a new update for Opnsense. And second point, they do lead with innovations and new technologies. So stuff like the VXLAN, zero tier, extra packages of stuff that you know you want, but it's not there. Like Opnsense typically leads with that. They bring these new extended features into the firewall for us to use and enjoy, and that's really something that they shine with. So I love that about Opnsense. And now the last point, it is also the open source successor of Monowall. One of the big guys of Monowall, one of the creators of Monowall, actually made a statement and said, hey guys, thank you for the support for Monowall. If you are a Monowall user, I highly encourage you to use Opnsense. So if the guy that made Monowall, you know, the people that came before Pfsense and Pfsense copied, is telling you to go for Opnsense, then that is actually saying something. That's actually a huge honor almost for the guy that made Monowall to say, hey, go for Opnsense. So I think that is so cool. But on the flip side, Pfsense has a massive or a large community, and I'm not even joking. If you look at the subreddits, the Pfsense subreddit is almost 100,000 members in size, whereas the Opnsense subreddit is something like 5,000. So there's definitely more people that are aware of Pfsense and that work with Pfsense and that has actively been using it over the years. So there's definitely the argument that if you ever run into any issues, that you can maybe reach out to somebody on the Reddit or forums or on Facebook or wherever, and you're more likely to have somebody that had a similar issue, and then they can point you in the correct direction of how to fix that issue. So that is a huge bonus point for Pfsense. It's got a massive community, and also the accessibility is there. Even though both firewalls function roughly the same and you can figure them both out the same way, Pfsense definitely is more accessible just due to the volumes of how-to guides and stuff that's available on the internet. This is from just written blog articles to actual YouTube videos. Like I mentioned, Tom from Lawrence Systems has a ton of videos, awesome videos on Pfsense showing you how to configure everything. I've even made a couple of videos on Pfsense. So the accessibility is there where people can actually show you how to get into the firewall and ease you into the process of learning it. So the learning curve isn't as steep as something like Opnsense, but since both firewalls work the same in principle, you can also kind of apply what you see in a how-to video for Pfsense onto something like Opnsense. Alright, so this is going to wrap up the presentation side. Let's actually jump into the firewall so I can show you what they look like and what they're doing. Alright, so I'm logged onto my Opnsense firewall, and as you can see, it looks pretty good, but this is with additional tweaking that has been done. I have added additional widgets, I've added additional columns, and I've changed the theme. I actually downloaded a plugin for a different theme, and this is the result of that. But in essence, your firewall will work the same. You will have a dashboard, and from the dashboard, you can navigate onto different types of spaces or configuration objects, let's say. And what I enjoy about Opnsense is it's got this arrow that you can click on, and you can either have this menu where you can click on the objects to go into something, or you can just have the arrow this way, which I like because this looks a little bit neater. And if you hover over any object, you can just hover over the next object, and then you can see if there's any additional configuration that you can do. And as you can see, Opnsense gives you stuff like reporting, system, different interfaces you can set up, obviously the firewall, which is huge. The routing is added as an additional plugin via the FRR package. It does this, it's the same with Pfsense. You also download the FRR package for that. You have your different VPNs that you can set up, and also zero tier is also an additional package or plugin that you need to install. It's not just here by default. Same for WireGuard. By default, you only have IPsec and OpenVPN with your Opnsense firewall. Other than that, it's additional plugins. And then we've got stuff like our services, power, and very important, help. So from here, you can get your documentation, and then there will be various different recipes and documentation of how to fix issues on your firewall or configure certain things, just so that you can do whatever you want to do on your firewall. Now, I just want to also navigate to the system firmware, and then from here, I just want to go into the plugins, because as I mentioned, there is a large scope of different plugins that you can install to do whatever you maybe want to do. If you just scroll down here, you can see there's stuff like the Open Connect is here. The Zabbix is here for the monitoring. Lots of different cool things like extra themes if you want to. And it's, again, this isn't just for Opnsense. Pfsense also has a package manager where you can install different things, but it's nice to see that you have this option. But what I like is when you go to your status, you can check for updates, and then if there aren't any new updates, it will just tell you what the update is. You can download the new update. Let me see if I can go to the changelog, because this is really cool. The changelog will obviously tell you what stuff has changed. So if I just scroll through here quickly, you can almost see that almost every month there has been a new patch that came out. As you can see, this is from January this year. So January, February, March, April, May. This is so cool. So you can see how consistent they are with updating. And what's nice is you can look at the changelog. You can just click on this little file or this little book, and it tells you exactly what the changes are, what they fixed, anything that they've actually made additional here. And we'll even tell you if FreeBSD has been updated, and that is so cool. So this is just a generic view of the Opnsense firewall. Let's quickly have a look at our Pfsense firewall. So for that, I'll just go into this Windows VM, and here I've got Pfsense running, and it's typically the same thing. You log in, you get prompted into your dashboard, and from your dashboard you will have various widgets that you can see, and then you can check what the widgets are doing. It will give you stuff like device information or system information if you have that widget. And the difference with Pfsense is it doesn't have this dashboard setting here where you can click on the arrows and have everything on the left hand on a panel. It's just here at the top, but this is fine as well. I also actually like how this looks. So you can just click on any of these objects for a drop-down menu, and it will tell you exactly where it's going to take you. So you got your system, your interfaces, your firewall, services, VPN, and just like Opnsense, the tail scale, where Opnsense uses 0 tier, here it's tail scale for Pfsense, which is just an additional package that was installed. We have statuses, diagnostics, and then important, the help. Help is always so important because help will allow you to just get onto the documentation quickly, and then you can figure out what is going on or how to set up any configuration object. Now, as you can see, Netgate actually has quite a beefy library. If I go into my software documentation for Pfsense, you'll definitely see there's a lot of different sections you can go into and just help you with whatever you're trying to set up or configure, which is quite nice. Now let's also just have a look at its plugin manager or package manager. So you can go to the system package manager, and here you should be able to see any packages that's been installed, or you can look at the available packages and just download whatever package you fancy. You can also just search for a package through this nifty search bar, but I'd like to maybe see the update. So if I go system update, and this is kind of like the downside of why the people are so confused with Community Edition, because this is version 2.6.0, which is what I just downloaded off of their site, and this is the same version from release, and it's the latest version, you know. So let's go onto the Pfsense website quickly. I think it's pfsense.org or .com, one of the two. There, this opened. Let's go download. So if I download here, you can see version 2.6.0. That's the latest build. And let's go back to the documentation because I actually want to have a look at the release. There we go. Let's see the release history. So here we can see that's Pfsense Plus software. And then even though Pfsense Plus had one additional update, you know, there was only one release at the February and then another release later or in the middle of the year. And here we can see the Pfsense CE software. There was only one build of 2.6.0 that released in February, and that's been it. And then if I go back to my Ubuntu VM quickly, go to the Opnsense docs, let's look at its releases. Here we can see there's different types of builds, like the Observant Owl was the previous or the older build, and then we have the new build for the Powerful Panther. So if we just click on that, we can actually see all the changes that was made. And if we scroll down, it's like giving you a ton of information of exactly what was changed. But this is kind of just like clicking on that little book to tell you what the updates were. But there's definitely a bit more of a change log on here. Similarly, if I do this and go on to forum.opnsense.org, and let's go forum.pfsense.org. If I look here and I look at the announcements, you can definitely see that the community edition for Opnsense, again, almost has a new announcement every week or second week or so, just explaining what's changing, and then you can just get those updates. Whereas Netgate, if we go into the Pfsense software, we go into their announcements. Announcements are very few and in between. So this is why a lot of people will tell you, if you want the latest and greatest, then you'll go for Opnsense. Alright, so this is where I want to end off the video and just give my thoughts on both firewalls. Since I had a lot of time, I had months to play with both of them actually. And I must say, I enjoy both of them. I think both firewalls are decent pieces of software and hardware if you get the hardware. I think there's a little bit, it's a little cheaper to get a Netgate than a Opnsense 10, but the software, it's pretty much on par. It's just that Opnsense is definitely more driven to be current and cutting edge, which is something that I prefer because I like having the latest builds and making sure that I have the latest security patches, that I'm not vulnerable to some type of exploit, and also just to make sure that I can deploy stuff like the Zero Tier or VXLAN as they come out. So that's really nice for me about Opnsense. That's why I actually made a post and say this is my open source firewall of choice, because it resonates with me a bit more. But don't let me tell you that you can't use Pfsense, because Pfsense is really just as good. It can do basically everything Opnsense can do. It's just not as current with all of the updates. And obviously there's a bit of controversy surrounding Pfsense that I feel like needed to be just brought up again, because it's almost like a Game of Thrones reference, that the good doesn't wash away the bad, even though they do a lot of good. Like, they need to also be accountable for the stuff that they have done in the past, and then they need to just keep working forward with that with the community, and they need to show that the community that they are going to keep Community Edition as something that they want. They're not just going to get rid of it, that they are going to make sure that people still get the support that they need. And then I really think that Pfsense is still fine. There's no reason not to use Pfsense. If you are using it and you've enjoyed it, continue using it. There's really no reason for you to switch firewalls. But again, I think Opnsense is doing an amazing job, and I'd like to see more from them. So this is me signing out. Thank you for watching the video, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye.